Good morning, church. It is good to be with you as it is each and every Sunday. And I'm so glad that we are here together in the presence of God and in the presence of one another to worship. And I want to say a special welcome to those that are joining us online this morning, those that are joining us on KTCU. It's good for us to be together even when we are apart. And it's good for us to worship together. So we are in the middle of a series that we are calling Unhurried. We're looking at the patient way of Jesus. You know, we talk a lot about the words of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, but we don't look much at the pace of the life and the ministry of Jesus. Jesus never seemed to be in much of a hurry. He had a full life, but it was never overfull. He was patient, and as people of faith, we are called to live in that same manner. So over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about how we live in a world that seems to be stuck on fast forward, that we are obsessed with speed, what some refer to as the cult of speed, and that many of us suffer from hurry sickness, an epidemic that impacts not just our physical bodies, not just our emotional health, but our spiritual lives as well. That this pace of life in which many of us find ourselves living is not congruent with the way of Jesus. That hurry can destroy our souls, keep us from living well, from living emotionally healthy and spiritually rich lives. The text that we're going to be looking at this morning is from Paul's first letter to the church in Rome, which is the longest of all the letters, which is somewhat ironic because we're just going to read one verse. In this letter, in the 12th chapter where we find ourselves, Paul is talking about salvation that is offered to us through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And here in this part, he is making a shift. It's sort of a pivot text, making a shift from theology, what we think and what we believe to be true, to ethics, about how we live that out. Paul talks about the transformation of our lives and the new life that is offered to us in Christ Jesus. So I invite you to listen now to this word from Paul's letter to the church in Rome.
Romans 12, verse 2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
What if I were to tell you that the single greatest threat, the greatest danger to your spiritual life is the phone that we carry in our pockets, in our purses, in our backpacks? You know, we tend to think that these phones work for us, but more and more, doesn't it feel like we work for them? The biggest threat to our spiritual life is our addiction, our compulsion for distraction that comes to us digitally. A number of years ago, Tristan Harris, who The Atlantic magazine referred to as the closest thing that Silicon Valley has to a conscience, was working at Google as a software engineer, but came disenfranchised with the tech industry, in part because he said it, quote, kicked off an arms race for people's attention. He now runs a nonprofit that advocates for a Hippocratic oath for software designers, because the general rule in the Silicon Valley, the general rule of technology, is that it is intentionally designed and engineered for distraction and for addiction. Makes sense, because that's where the money is, right? Because the more that they can distract us, the more that they can addict us, the more time we'll spend scrolling through and looking at those ads. We think that our phones work for us, but we work for them. The economists now call this the attention economy. Way back in 1985, Neil Postman wrote a book called Assuming Ourselves to Death. And it was a book about the impact of TV and entertainment on our culture. Has anybody read this book? Okay, good, don't. It is awful. I mean, it's a brilliant book, but it's hard to read, and it's very, very dark and depressing. And he says in this book, back in 1985, that the two areas of society that he predicted would be the most damaged by TV and entertainment culture would be politics and religion. Politics, he said, if we continue to go down this road, we'll find ourselves where TV celebrities would replace intelligent and wise leaders. And when it comes to religion, depth and discipleship will give way to superficial, feel-good spirituality. So clearly, he didn't know what he was talking about. You know, there's little debate today among psychologists and sociologists, and I would argue ordinary people like you and me, that for every leap forward in digital technology, that we pay a cost. That we pay a cost, not just the money that we pay, but we emotionally, spiritually pay a cost. And we find ourselves inundated on all sides by screens, by entertainment options, by outlets for curating a fabricated image of our lives. And all of that has led to what Carlos Romani says is the most distracted generation in human history. That we are the most distracted generation in human history. So let me give you a little bit of a quiz here to see how up to date you are on your technology. If you had to guess how many times a day, on average, the typical iPhone user touches his or her phone, not checks it, that happens about every 12 minutes according to studies, but touches their phone, every swipe, every tap, every click, what would you say? According to a recent study, the average person touches their smartphone 2,617 times a day. Heavy users, you know who you are. You touch your phone 5,427 times a day. Now, that same study found that the average user spends about 2.5 hours every single day in 76 different sessions on their phones. Millennials, I'm going to pick on you for a minute. For you, the average is 5.5 hours a day. And so when we hear this, we have to ask ourselves, what is this costing us? What is this costing us? And I'm not just talking about our time, although the argument could be made that our time is our most precious and most valuable resource. It is certainly limited. But another cost is that we are losing our capacity to simply pay attention. We are losing our capacity to pay attention. Edith Wharton, who was the first woman to ever win a Pulitzer Prize, said a century ago, coining this phrase, the power of sustained attention. Now, what's interesting about this is that she was using this, coining this phrase, the power of sustained attention, railing against the threat of a new technology that had just come out called the radio. She was saying that it is destroying our capacity to pay attention and to think well. The truth is that very few of us have the power of sustained attention. In fact, studies show that the attention span is dropping each passing year. Back in 2000, the year 2000, the average attention span, when somebody could think about something without another thought or image or distraction coming into their mind, was 12 seconds. 2024, that number is now 8 seconds. To put that in perspective, A goldfish has a attention span of 9 seconds. People, we are losing to goldfish. Now look, I don't want to be a harbinger of doom. There's certainly enough of that. And I don't want to be an idealist ever and say, oh, we just need to get rid of all the phones. I love my phone. And to be honest with you, I can't imagine life without it, and I still wonder how the heck we survived without them before they were invented. But the dropping capacity for paying attention is a giant problem in our culture. Think about it this way: as society as a whole, the political mess that we find ourselves in, the complexity of the world demands the power of sustained attention. But I would argue, too, that perhaps the greatest threat, and even greater threat than that, is the damage that it does to our souls. Last week, if you were here, you may remember that I offered a definition of the spiritual life, of spirituality, from John Mark Comer, who's a pastor out in Portland. And he says essentially that our spiritual life, or spirituality, however you want to frame it, is our capacity to receive and to give love in relationship to God and to others. That to break it down in its most simplest form, spirituality is the capacity to receive and to give love in relationship to God and to those around us. Friends, without power of sustained attention, we cannot have a spiritual life, or at least much of one, let alone grow into mature of people of love. To be people of love, which I would argue is what we all ache for, what we all long to be, people of love. And that's why my deep conviction as a pastor, as a parent, as a person, as a fellow follower of Jesus, addicted to his phone himself, is that for us to live spiritually healthy lives, we must ruthlessly eliminate digital distraction from our lives. Let me ask you this. Confession time. How many of you have ever thought of something that you need to do on your phone? Check a date. Post a text. Send a text. Do anything. You think, you know what, I need to do that real quick. And you pick up your phone, and 15 minutes later, you realize, what have I been doing for the last 15 minutes? And you get frustrated, and you put your phone down, and you walk away, and you realize you didn't do the thing that you picked up your phone to do in the first place. How many have ever done that? Thank God I'm not the only one. We are so easily distracted. Our phones, our digital distraction, is the greatest threat to our spiritual lives. And like I said, friends, I'm with you. I'm with you on this, and I am shocked when I pay attention, when I become just aware how easy it is to distract me, how easily manipulated I am, my lack of discipline, my lack of self-control, how much time and energy and attention I waste on a day-to-day. And I suspect that I'm not alone on that. John Mark Comer, who I mentioned a moment ago, he writes and teaches extensively on the elimination of hurry. In fact, it was his book that was sort of the genesis, the idea for this series. He invites us to think about adopting what he refers to as digital asceticism. Digital asceticism. Now, asceticism is a word that we don't use much, at least in our tradition, and it dates back to the fall of the Roman Empire back in the 4th century, when two things were happening at once. One, the way of Jesus, Christianity, as it came to be known, was legalized under Constantine. And as so doing, the church moves to the center, moves to the power, and with it comes a rise in what is oftentimes referred to as cultural Christianity. And because it was no longer taboo and illegal, it became somewhat watered down in the process. Now, at that same time, the Roman Empire, was experiencing incredible decline, both moral, both socio-political, all of which led to the fall of Rome by the Visigoths in 410, and even more in the decades later. It was around that time that Augustine wrote the book City of God, writing about Rome, which he was watching crumble all around him. And not long after that, Benedict wrote up what he refers to as his rule of life, the disciplines that he would use and incorporate to become the person that he wanted to be the Christian that he longed and desired to be. And that rule of life, that way of living, led to the Benedictine monastic movement to try and create a community of calm in the midst of a culture of chaos. Asceticism is a fascinating word. In Greek, it's agizomai, and the word is actually best translated as discipline. It's an athletic word. It's a workout routine. It's a training regimen. In order to change their bodies and their minds, athletes take on a discipline, a regimen. And the monks adopted this, seeing themselves as God's athletes, if you will, and put themselves on their own strict training regimen, but theirs was of spiritual disciplines: fasting, praying, meditating, worshiping, silence. What I find interesting about that is how they responded to the fall of the church. The decline of culture was not to do whatever they could just to make church cool, to bring people back. Nor was it to simply throw up their arms and say, well, it is what it is, what are we going to do? Instead, they went in the opposite direction, toward a life of discipline, of regimen. Many historians, theologians, people much smarter than me are now pointing out the parallels between our culture today and that of the days of Benedict and Augustine. Think about it. We are living in a time of decline in our Western culture. There's the chaos and the anger and the anxiety, the outrage, the discourse, that it's just going to get worse before it gets better. And I know what you're thinking. Maybe after the election, things will calm down. People will be kinder on Twitter, that sort of thing. But just as the followers of Jesus in that cultural movement leaned into discipline and practices, that the time has come for us to focus on that too. To technology in general, to our phones in particular, which for many of us, if we're honest, which I hope we will always be in this place, is not just a distraction, but it is an addiction. It is quite literally something that separates us from the awareness of God, which is the very definition of sin. Now, I know what you're saying. You can put up an argument and say, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about smartphones. True. You got me on that one. It doesn't say anything about technology. There's no commandment, thou shalt turn off your phone one day a week. There's nothing like that. There's no compelling reason in Scripture to turn off our notification, but it does say a lot about turning our attention to God, away from those things that stand in the way of living the life that we are called to live. It also warns greatly of idols, about worshiping the golden calves. The Israelites grew tired of waiting for Moses and God to act, and so they took it upon themselves and started worshiping golden statues, golden calves. I can't help but wonder if in our generation we have turned our phones, our screens, into golden calves. Have you ever noticed in this economy of time and attention that when somebody gives you their full attention, completely is there, puts away their phone, eliminates all the other distraction, listens with their whole body in that moment, that in that moment we feel seen, we feel heard, we feel loved, and I would argue we feel loved well. One of my favorite cultural analysis people is Simon Sinek. And a number of years ago, he did a Q&A at the end of one of his speaking engagements. And in the midst of that, we don't know what the question is, or at least I don't. But he walked down from the stage where he was, and he walked down to the first row and asked someone for their cell phone, who they reluctantly gave up in that moment. And he picked it up and he said, I want you to notice the psychological power of this device. He said, notice that I'm just holding it. It's not buzzing. It's not ringing. I'm not on it. I'm just holding it. But then he says, turning to the crowd, do you feel in this moment that you are the most important thing to me right now? Everyone said, well, no. He said, that's the association. So when we walk into a meeting, when we sit down for a meal, when we have coffee with a friend, and we set it down on the table, oh, and if we're really generous, we'll even turn it over so it's face down. What we are saying, what we are communicating, whether we intend to or not, the message that is sent is, you aren't the most important thing to me. This is. You aren't the most important person to me. Whoever's about to call, buzz, text, tweet, they are much more important than the conversation I'm having with you. It needs to be put away, he says, so you can give your full attention to the person, to the people that you are with. So let me just say this. If you wake up in the morning and you check your phone before you say good morning to the people in your household, there's a pretty good chance you've got a problem. If you have to take your phone with you from room to room, constantly holding it in your hand, there's a pretty good chance you have a problem. If you have checked your phone in the middle of this sermon, you definitely have a problem. You see, when we are holding our phone, we are telling the people around us, you're not the most important thing to me right now. And I would argue the same is true in our relationship with God. That when we hold our phone, we're saying to God, God, I'm here for you, I'm praying right now. But really, this golden calf, this idol that I hold in my hand, this is what I really worship the most. The time and the attention that we give to God is how we give and receive love, and how we give love back to God. And therefore, the greatest gift that we can give to God is our time and our attention. And the more that we do that, the more time and attention that we give to God, the more that we become people of love. It was Epictetus, the great Greek Stoic philosopher, 135 years before Jesus, said, you become what you give your attention to. We become what we give our attention to, for better or for worse, I would argue. And if you want to become a person of love, we need to give our time and our attention to God. And friends, as followers of Jesus, we have to take this seriously. So in this series, I've been offering you each week a practice, a task, homework if you want. Well, here's what it is for this week. At some point this afternoon when you get home, I want you to, if you have an iPhone, to pull up your screen time report. To pull up your screen time report. If you have an iPhone, it's pretty easy. If you don't know how to do it, just ask your grandchild. And I'm assuming that if there's another Android or Google or whatever the other phones are, that there's probably a way to do that as well. But here's what I want you to do. I want you just to notice, to be fully aware of just how much time you are spending on your phone. Just to notice. My guess is that it will be eye-opening for you. It always is for me. But here's the hard part. Here's the hard part, church. I want you, once you find out how much time you spend on your phone, I want you to share it with somebody. I want you to have an accountability partner this week. And I want you to tell them how much time you have spent in the last week looking at your phone, and I want them to tell you. to have that level of accountability, because over the next 7 days, the invitation for you is to do everything that you can to minimize the amount of time you spend on your phone by 10%. 10%, that sounds easy, right? Consider it your tithe of your time and attention to God. So maybe this week, you don't take your phone with you to the bathroom. Maybe you don't look at it while you're eating. You don't pick it up when you automatically have a moment of downtime, that you try and reduce by 10%. And then at the end of next week, I want you to check back in with your accountability partner and to see how you did and to see how they did. Now, if you really want to take this seriously, I want to invite you to develop what Comer refers to as a digital rule of life. In the spirit of St. Benedict, who came up with practices and disciplines in order to live the life, Comer invites us to create our own digital rule of life, to think about the type of person you want to be. What is going to be the practices for you and for your family? That maybe you decide, you know what? For one afternoon a week, I'm going to turn the phone off, I'm going to put it away, I'm going to have a digital Sabbath. Or maybe what you say is, you know what, I'm going to start by turning off all the alerts. Maybe you're going to say in your family, no cell phones at the table. Or maybe watch only one screen at a time. No more scrolling while you're watching TV. Maybe you determine that the phone sleeps in another room. Because I know the greatest example, the greatest argument that I get in my household is, but I use it as an alarm clock. To which I remind them, they sell alarm clocks. Maybe you determine that you're not going to look at your phone for 30 minutes when you wake up. Whatever it is, to create your digital way of life. And if I could offer a book suggestion, I would point you to a book called The Tech-Wise Family: Everyday Steps for Putting Technology in Its Place. It's a book by Andy Crouch. And it's not just a book of tips, but it encourages you to ask questions like, who do we want to be as a family? What do we want to be important? And how does our use of any particular technology, whether it be the phone, the internet, the television, how does that particular technology move us closer or further away from that goal of who we want to be as a family? Let me just say this. From time to time, at the end of a sermon like this, somebody will come to me and say, Russ, I felt like you were speaking just to me. I want you to know that I'm not. In fact, I'm speaking to myself. I'm preaching to myself, and I'm just simply inviting you to listen in to my own thoughts, to my own prayers, to my own longings, to my own wishes. Because let me tell you this, that my phone, the internet, the digital distraction is the single greatest threat to my spiritual life, hands down. And if I'm going to live the life that I want to live, if I'm going to be the pastor that you have called me to be, if I'm going to be the parent that my children need me to be, if I'm going to be the spouse that my wife deserves, if I'm going to be the person that I want to be, to live the life that I've been created to live, I've got to be better about eliminating digital distraction in my life. Do not be conformed to this age, Paul says, but be transformed by the renewing of the mind, that we might give our time and our attention to God, that we might be transformed into people of love. Amen.